The alarm did not sound like a warning. It sounded like the end of something. I was standing behind General Edward Locke when the doors of the conference hall opened and the alien delegation walked in like they already owned the floor beneath their feet. My name is Oliver Bennett. I was a communications officer, nothing more. A man who translated signals and read tone in voices that were not human. That day, I was the only person in the room who understood every word the enemy said, and every word chilled me. Their leader called himself Vorak Theln, a commander of the Kael'th Dominion, a coalition of worlds that had crossed the stars looking for planets to take. He stood tall, his skin a pale shade of gray, his eyes narrow and calculating. He did not bow, he did not greet us. He simply looked around the room, at our uniforms, our weapons, our nervous faces, and he laughed. "This is what we were warned about," he said, his voice flat through the translator device on his collar. "A species that still burns fuel to fly, a species that still fights its own wars over borders and flags. You call this civilization?" No one answered him. General Locke's jaw was tight, but he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Our ships, our best ships, had been destroyed within minutes of the Dominion fleet arriving in orbit. Our satellites went dark one by one. Every attempt to fight back had ended the same way, in silence and static. "We have studied your world for 3 of your years," Vorak Theln continued. "We watched your wars. We watched your politics. We watched you argue about resources you have plenty of. You are not a threat. You are a resource, nothing more." I felt the words land like small stones in my chest. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true, at least on the surface. We had spent so long fighting each other that we had never noticed how unprepared we were for something coming from outside. Grace Sutton stood beside me. She was a young intelligence officer, sharp-eyed, calm in a way that made the rest of us feel steadier just by being near her. She leaned toward me and whispered, "He's enjoying this too much." I nodded, but I kept my eyes on the alien commander. There was something behind his confidence, something almost rehearsed, like a man reciting lines he had said 100 times before to 100 other worlds. "You have 2 options," Vorak Theln said, addressing General Locke directly now. "Surrender your world peacefully, and your people will be permitted to serve the Dominion, or resist, and we will remove the resistance piece by piece, city by city, until there is nothing left to resist with." The room was silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. Somewhere far above us, in orbit, hundreds of alien warships waited, their shadows already visible from the ground at certain hours of the day, dark shapes crossing the sky like a slow-moving storm that never broke. General Locke finally spoke. His voice was steady, but I could hear the effort behind it. "We need time to consult with our leadership, all of it, every nation." Vorak Theln smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "You have 1 day. After that, we begin to take what we came for, whether you agree or not." They left without another word, their footsteps echoing down the long hall until the doors closed behind them. For a moment nobody moved. Then the room broke into noise, officers shouting into phones, aides running for secure lines, someone crying quietly in the corner. I stepped outside for air, and that was when I first felt it. It was faint, barely more than a whisper through the soles of my boots, a vibration so small I thought at first it was a passing vehicle. But there were no vehicles nearby. The street was empty except for soldiers standing guard, and none of them reacted. I looked down at the ground as if I could see through the concrete to whatever had caused it. Grace came out behind me, pulling her jacket tighter against the cold morning air. "You felt that too," she said. It was not a question. Felt what? The shake, just now. She frowned, glancing toward the horizon where the sky was still streaked with the pale trails of alien ships entering the atmosphere. I thought it was just nerves. I almost told her it was nothing. Almost. But something in the back of my mind refused to let the moment go. I had grown up on the coast, in a small town where old fishermen used to tell stories about the sea remembering things, about currents that shifted whenever storms threatened the shore, as if the ocean itself were choosing sides. I had always thought those stories were just stories, comforting nonsense for children who were afraid of the dark water. That night, I could not sleep. I sat in the makeshift command center that had been set up beneath the old university building, surrounded by screens showing feeds from cities across the globe. Fires burned in some regions where the Dominion had already begun demonstrations of strength, as they called them, small strikes meant to show us what resistance would cost. Margaret Ashford found me there around 2 in the morning. She was a geologist, one of the last civilian scientists still allowed near military operations, because her knowledge of Earth's deep structure had once been useful for building shelters. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back in a messy knot, dark circles beneath her eyes. "You should see this," she said, sliding a tablet across the table toward me. On the screen was a seismograph reading, lines that spiked and dipped in patterns I did not understand. "What am I looking at?" "Tremors," she said, "all across the planet, not from the alien attacks. These started before the first strike even happened." I frowned, leaning closer. "Earthquakes happen all the time. Not like this." She tapped the screen, scrolling through more data. "These are synchronized. Every major tectonic plate on Earth moved within the same 6-hour window. That does not happen. That has never happened, not in over a century of records." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. What could cause that? Margaret shook her head slowly. "I don't know, but there's something else." She hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "There's a formation deep beneath the Pacific, near the Mariana Trench. We've known about it for decades, but no one could explain it. It doesn't match any natural rock formation. It's too symmetrical, too structured. We always assumed it was some strange geological anomaly, maybe volcanic in origin. And now it's giving off an energy signature we've never recorded before. It started an hour after the aliens entered orbit." I stared at her, my mind racing to make sense of it. "You think it's connected to them?" "I think," she said quietly, "that whatever is down there noticed them arrive." Before I could respond, the ground shook again, harder this time, enough to rattle the cups on the table and send a ripple through the water in a nearby glass. Alarms went off somewhere upstairs, distant and muffled through the concrete. Margaret and I looked at each other, and for the first time since the invasion began, I saw something other than fear in her eyes. I saw curiosity, sharp and unsettled, the look of someone standing at the edge of a discovery too large to fully understand. Outside, the sirens of the city mixed with the low hum of alien patrol ships passing overhead. Somewhere in Vorak Theln's fleet, sensors would have detected the tremor too, and I wondered if they understood what it meant, or if, like us, they simply dismissed it as background noise from a planet they believed had already been conquered in every way that mattered. They believed Earth was weak. They believed our wars, our divisions, our slow way of moving between nations and treaties, made us an easy world to take. They had studied our history, and our politics, and our weapons, and they had judged us by all of it. But no one had studied the ground beneath our feet. No one had asked why every ancient culture on this planet, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of years, told stories of something sleeping beneath the earth, something vast and patient, something that only woke when the world itself was in true danger. I thought about those stories that night as another tremor rolled gently through the floor, softer than the last but no less certain. I thought about old maps marked with warnings no modern scientist ever explained. I thought about legends of buried titans and sleeping gods, dismissed for centuries as nothing more than fear, given shape by people who did not understand the natural world. Margaret packed up her tablet and looked toward the window, where the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, pale and uncertain. "Whatever this is," she said, "it's not finished. This was just the start." I did not sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the city breathe around me, the distant hum of alien ships circling above, like vultures waiting for permission to land. And beneath it all, so faint I could have imagined it, a slow and steady pulse rising from somewhere deep within the planet itself, patient, ancient, and no longer entirely still. For the first time since the invasion began, I found myself wondering if Vorak Thelm and his fleet had made a mistake far greater than any of us yet understood. They had come expecting silence. They had come expecting surrender. They had no idea that something older than every empire they had ever conquered was finally beginning to open its eyes. By the third day, the world had stopped pretending things would return to normal. I woke to the sound of distant thunder that was not thunder at all. It was the sound of alien strike craft breaking through the clouds over the eastern coast, delivering what Vorak Thelm called a demonstration. Cities were being hit in careful, calculated ways, not enough to destroy everything, but enough to remind us who held the power. I had stopped counting how many hours of sleep I had lost. Grace Sutton looked the same, her eyes red-rimmed, her uniform wrinkled from nights spent on a cot in the command center rather than a real bed. "They're moving faster than the intelligence reports predicted," she told me as we walked through the underground corridors toward the briefing room. "Locke thinks they're trying to force a surrender before any nation can organize real resistance." "Can we organize real resistance?" I asked. She did not answer right away, which told me everything I needed to know. Inside the briefing room, General Locke stood before a wall of screens showing troop movements, ship positions, and casualty numbers that made my stomach turn. Margaret Ashford was there too, along with a dozen other scientists and officers who had been pulled into what people were now quietly calling the Anomaly Division, a name given to the handful of researchers trying to understand the strange tremors that had begun before the first Dominion ship even entered our atmosphere. "Talk to me," Locke said, his voice tired but firm. "What do we know?" Margaret stepped forward, pulling up a global map dotted with red markers. "These are the locations of confirmed seismic anomalies over the last 72 hours. She traced a finger across the screen, pointing to clusters near the Himalayas, the Andes, the deep trenches of the Pacific, and several sites scattered across ancient deserts and frozen tundra. At first, we thought these were unrelated. Different plates, different depths, different causes. But when we cross-referenced the timing, we found something impossible. "Impossible how?" Locke asked. "The tremors are moving," Margaret said. "Like a wave, or a signal, passing from one point to another across the entire planet, faster than any seismic energy should be able to travel through solid rock. It's as if something is communicating with itself, node to node, using the Earth's crust as a kind of pathway." The room fell silent, except for the hum of machines and the distant murmur of soldiers passing outside the door. "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice lower now. "Every one of these locations has appeared in human folklore for thousands of years, not as coincidence, as warning." She pulled up images on the screen, ancient carvings and paintings from cultures separated by oceans and centuries, all depicting similar shapes, coiled forms beneath mountains, sleeping giants beneath the sea, guardians said to wake only when the world itself was threatened. Different names in different languages, but the same core idea repeated again and again across human history. "You're saying our ancestors knew about this," Locke said slowly. "I'm saying our ancestors experienced something," Margaret corrected. "Whether they understood what it was, I can't say. But the stories were never just stories. They were memory, passed down long enough that the truth behind them was lost. I thought back to the fishermen from my childhood town, their tales of the sea choosing sides during storms, and for the first time I wondered if there had been a grain of truth buried beneath all that superstition, waiting patiently to be uncovered." Grace crossed her arms, studying the map. "Even if all of this is true, what does it mean for us right now? We have a fleet in orbit, preparing to break what's left of our defenses. We don't have time for ancient mysteries." "It might mean more than you think," Margaret said. 2 hours ago, a Dominion patrol ship attempted to fly directly over the Mariana Anomaly site. Every system on board failed instantly. Engines, weapons, even basic life support flickered before the crew managed to divert away. We only know this because we intercepted their emergency communication. Locke's expression shifted. sharp interest replacing exhaustion. Their own technology failed near the site. Completely, Margaret confirmed. Whatever is down there is generating a field strong enough to disrupt advanced alien systems, and it's growing stronger by the hour. For the first time since the invasion began, I saw something dangerous spark in General Locke's eyes. Not fear, hope, carefully guarded, the kind that soldiers learn to hide because hope, unchecked, can be as dangerous as despair. "Can we use this?" he asked. "We don't understand it well enough to use it," Margaret admitted. "We don't even know what it is. A natural phenomenon, a weapon left behind by something ancient, or something alive, reacting to a threat the same way an animal reacts to danger." The thought settled heavily over the room. Something alive, something old enough to predate every human civilization, buried beneath oceans and mountains, silent for thousands of years, only now beginning to stir because our planet, for the first time in recorded history, faced a threat it could not ignore. That evening, I was sent with a small team to a coastal town near one of the anomaly sites, tasked with helping evacuate civilians before the Dominion could target the region directly. The drive there was quiet, except for the occasional distant flash of alien ships moving across the darkening sky like slow predators circling their prey. The town was smaller than I expected, a cluster of houses and fishing boats along a rocky shoreline, the kind of place that still felt disconnected from the chaos unfolding in larger cities. An elderly man named Frederick Doyle met our convoy at the edge of town, his weathered face calm despite the tension around him. He had lived there his entire life, and when Grace explained why we had come, he only nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting us for years. "You're here about the shaking," he said, not a question. "You felt it too," I said. "Felt it my whole life," Frederick replied. "Just never this strong. My grandfather used to say, 'The ground here remembers things.' Said there was something beneath the water that watched over the coast, something that woke up whenever real danger came close." He looked out toward the dark horizon where alien ships passed silently overhead. Guess he was right. That night, as we helped families load what little they could carry onto transport trucks, the ground shook again, stronger than before, strong enough to knock loose dishes from shelves and send small waves rolling unnaturally across the otherwise calm sea. Somewhere out past the shoreline, the water churned in a pattern that did not match any natural current, circular and deliberate, as if something vast were beginning to shift position far beneath the surface. Grace stood beside me, watching the water with an expression I had never seen on her before, somewhere between fear and awe. "Bennett," she said quietly, "tell me you see that too." I did. Lights, faint and blue, glowed briefly beneath the waves before fading again, patterns too structured to be natural bioluminescence, patterns that almost looked like a heartbeat. Above us, a Dominion patrol craft altered its course sharply, veering away from the coastline as if its pilot had suddenly decided the area was no longer safe to fly over. I watched it go, my pulse quickening, and for the first time since Vorak Thelm had stood in that conference hall and called us weak, I felt something other than fear settle into my chest. I felt certainty. Whatever slept beneath our world was no longer sleeping quietly, and soon, the ones who had underestimated us would learn exactly what that meant. Frederick Doyle placed a steady hand on my shoulder as the last of the evacuation trucks pulled away from the shore. "Don't be afraid of the shaking, son," he said, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had spent his whole life listening to a planet others had stopped paying attention to. "Be afraid for anyone standing in its way when it finally decides to move." We drove back through the night beneath a sky filled with alien warships, but for the first time, I noticed something different in their formation. They were no longer moving with the same confidence as before. Patrol routes shifted unpredictably. Communications between ships grew more frequent, more urgent. Whatever they were detecting from the depths of our oceans and the roots of our mountains, it was enough to make even a conquering fleet reconsider how safe they truly were. Back at command, Margaret greeted us with fresh data pulled from monitoring stations across the globe. The tremors had not stopped. If anything, they were accelerating, moving with clear intention now rather than random distribution, converging slowly toward specific points as if something enormous were gathering its strength before finally deciding to rise. "It's not finished waking up," she said, staring at the data with a mixture of fear and wonder. "I think this was only the beginning." Outside, the night sky flickered with the distant light of alien engines repositioning in a hurry, and somewhere beneath the restless ocean, a presence older than human memory continued its slow and unstoppable return to the surface of the world it had once sworn to protect. "I will remember the fifth day for the rest of my life, however long that turns out to be." It began with silence, which should have warned me. For 4 days, the sky above our command center had been filled with the low hum of alien engines, constant and mechanical, a sound so steady that people had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the hum of a refrigerator in a quiet house. That morning, the hum was gone. I stepped outside into a gray dawn and realized the silence itself felt heavier than any explosion. Grace found me standing in the courtyard, staring up at an empty sky. "Patrol routes went dark 20 minutes ago," she said. "Every Dominion ship in this hemisphere pulled back to high orbit at the same time." "Why would they retreat?" I asked. "They didn't retreat," she said. "They repositioned. Locke thinks they're preparing something bigger." We did not have to wait long to find out. Within the hour, alarms rang through every speaker in the command center, and Margaret Ashford's voice cut through the chaos with an urgency I had never heard from her before. "Everyone to the main terminal, now." The screen showed a live feed from a seismic monitoring station near the Pacific Anomaly site, the same location that had been growing steadily more active since the invasion began. What had once been slow, deliberate pulses of energy had transformed into something else entirely. The readings spiked off the chart, then simply stopped registering, as if the instruments themselves could no longer comprehend what they were measuring. "Talk to me," Locke said, striding into the room with the weight of command still steady in his voice, despite everything. "The anomaly site is breaching," Margaret said, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the display. "Whatever is down there, it's coming up." On the satellite feed, a massive section of the Pacific Ocean churned violently, water rising in columns hundreds of feet high before collapsing back into swirling chaos. Ships nearby, both human and alien, scrambled to move away from the disturbance, but not fast enough. I watched in stunned silence as a Dominion cruiser positioned too close to the site was suddenly lifted from the water, not by wind or wave, but by something vast moving directly beneath it, something that broke the surface just long enough to reveal a shape too large and too strange for any of us to fully process, before the ship tumbled aside like a toy caught in a bathtub. "What is that?" Grace whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise in the room. Nobody answered because nobody knew. The shape that had surfaced defied easy description. It was not simply a creature, not in the way any biologist would classify one, nor was it purely mechanical in the way our best engineers understood machines. It seemed to be both, ancient stone and living tissue woven together, vast plates that shifted like armor across a form so large that a single limb breaking the surface of the ocean created waves capable of swamping nearby vessels. Where the light touched it, faint blue patterns pulsed rhythmically across its surface, the same pattern of glowing lines Grace and I had witnessed off the coast days earlier, only now magnified beyond anything either of us had imagined. Vorak Theln's fleet reacted immediately, and for the first time since their arrival, I heard genuine confusion in their communications, which our systems had continued to intercept throughout the occupation. Orders shouted across encrypted channels, commanders demanding explanations from subordinates who had none to give, weapons systems firing blindly at a target too massive and too fast for their targeting arrays to properly track. "They're panicking," Grace said, disbelief evident in her voice. I understood why. The Dominion had crossed the stars, conquering world after world, each one falling before their advanced technology and disciplined forces. They had studied Earth for years, cataloging our weapons, our politics, our divisions, judging us weak because we fought each other instead of standing united. They had never once considered that our world itself might possess defenses far older and far more powerful than anything humanity had built. Over the following hours, reports poured in from monitoring stations across the globe, each one more difficult to believe than the last. The entity, which Margaret's team had begun quietly referring to as the Warden, was not confined to a single location. Similar disturbances erupted simultaneously at other anomaly sites around the world: the Himalayan range, deep beneath the Andes, hidden chambers within the Arctic ice. Whatever this presence was, it existed as something distributed across the entire planet, a network of ancient guardianship rather than a single isolated creature, each surfacing point connected to the others through channels running deep beneath the crust. "It's not one being," Margaret said, staring at the data with wide, exhausted eyes. "Or maybe it is, in the way our own body is one being, even though it has many parts. This might be a single intelligence, expressed simultaneously across multiple points on the planet." "Can it be reasoned with?" Locke asked. Margaret hesitated before answering. "I don't know if it thinks the way we do. I don't even know if it recognizes individual nations, or governments, or borders. All I know is that it did not act until the threat to this planet became severe enough to warrant a response." I thought about that carefully. For thousands of years, human beings had fought wars against each other, had drawn borders and broken treaties and caused suffering on scales that still shame our history. Through all of it, whatever slept beneath the surface had remained still, unmoved by our conflicts, patient in a way that suggested it understood something about the nature of internal struggle that we ourselves often failed to grasp. It was not our wars against each other that woke it. It was the threat of losing the planet entirely to something from beyond it. By midday, the situation above the Pacific had escalated beyond anything our monitoring systems could fully capture. Vorak Theln's flagship, a vessel larger than any structure humans had ever built, moved into direct engagement range, its weapons systems charging with enough power to be detected from orbit. I watched the feed with my heart pounding, certain that whatever advantage the Warden held would not be enough against the concentrated firepower of an entire alien battle fleet. The flagship fired first, a beam of energy bright enough to briefly wash out our satellite cameras, striking directly against the Warden's surfaced form, with a force that should have ended the confrontation instantly. When the light faded, the creature remained exactly where it had been, unmoved, the impact point already beginning to seal itself with the same faint blue glow we had seen pulsing across its skin. "That should have vaporized a mountain," Grace said quietly. "It absorbed it," Margaret said, staring at the readings with something close to reverence. "The energy didn't destroy it, it fed it." What happened next unfolded too quickly for words to properly capture, though I have replayed the memory countless times since, trying to hold on to every detail. The Warden moved, and the ocean itself seemed to move with it, vast currents shifting in response to its passage as it rose fully from the depths for the first time in recorded human history. Its form stretched across a distance that dwarfed even the largest Dominion vessels, ancient and impossible, plated in something between stone and living material, its many points of light pulsing now in a rhythm that felt less like a heartbeat and more like a war drum. Alien ships that had been firing moments before now scrambled to retreat, their formations breaking apart in disorder as pilots abandoned strategy in favor of simple survival. But the Warden did not pursue with the chaotic fury I had expected from something so massive. Its movements carried a strange precision, almost deliberate, as though it understood exactly which vessels posed genuine threats and which did not. Ships that turned to flee were largely left untouched. Ships that continued firing were met with consequences swift and absolute, pulled beneath the waves or crushed within limbs that moved with a speed impossible for something of such size. "It's not attacking randomly," I said, watching the pattern unfold. "It's responding to aggression specifically." Margaret nodded slowly, transfixed by the feed. "It's not fighting a war, It's enforcing a boundary. Within the command center, officers who had spent the last 5 days preparing for humanity's slow defeat now stood in stunned silence, watching as the very planet they had been prepared to lose seemed to rise up in its own defense. I felt Grace's hand find mine at some point during those chaotic hours, gripping tightly, and I did not let go, grounding myself in the simple certainty of another person's presence, while the world around us transformed into something none of us could have imagined only a week earlier. Vorak Theln's voice crackled across intercepted alien channels sometime in the late afternoon, no longer carrying the arrogant confidence I remembered from the conference hall. His words were clipped, urgent, directed at his remaining commanders as he ordered a full withdrawal from the immediate region surrounding the anomaly site. "This was not accounted for," he said, and even through the imperfect translation, I could hear something close to disbelief in his voice. This was not in any survey. This planet was documented as undefended. I almost laughed, though there was nothing funny about the moment. Undefended. They had studied our satellites and our armies and our arguments, and they had concluded, reasonably by their own standards, that a species too divided to unite against each other could not possibly present a serious threat to a coordinated invasion force. What they had failed to account for was the possibility that Earth itself, independent of humanity's own conflicts, held defenses that had nothing to do with our politics or our weapons. By evening, the Dominion fleet had pulled back to a safer distance in high orbit, their formations still disorganized, their communications filled with confusion and disagreement about how to proceed. The Warden, for its part, did not pursue them into space. It remained near the surface of the ocean, vast and still, its glowing patterns slowly dimming as though settling into a watchful rest, rather than a full return to slumber. Margaret's team worked through the night analyzing every scrap of data collected during the encounter, trying to piece together some understanding of what exactly humanity had witnessed. I stayed with them, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion, drawn by a need to understand something that felt too large for my mind to fully hold. "It's not just one location," Margaret explained near midnight, her voice hoarse from hours of talking. "Every anomaly site around the world shares a connection to this thing, this Warden, or whatever it truly is. I think what we witnessed today was only a fraction of its full presence. I think it can manifest wherever it's needed most, wherever the threat is greatest." "Where did it come from?" I asked. "How long has it been down there?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't know if we'll ever have a complete answer. Some of the geological formations connected to these sites are old enough that our current models can't even properly date them. Whatever built this, or whatever this is, it may predate human civilization entirely. It may predate anything we currently understand about our planet's history." I thought of Frederick Doyle standing on that quiet coastline, speaking of stories passed down through generations of fishermen who had lived beside the sea long enough to sense something the rest of us had forgotten to notice. I thought of ancient carvings depicting sleeping giants and coiled guardians, dismissed for centuries as superstition. Perhaps those stories had never been myths in the way we assumed. Perhaps they had simply been memory, stretched thin across too many generations to survive as anything more than folklore, waiting patiently for a moment like this one to prove they had been true all along. Grace joined us sometime after midnight, exhaustion etched into every line of her face, though her eyes still carried the same disbelief and wonder I imagined mirrored my own. "Locke wants to know if we can communicate with it," she said. "If there's any way to establish contact." Margaret looked up, her expression uncertain. "I don't know if it wants to be contacted. I don't know if it even recognizes us as separate from the threat it responded to. For all we know, it may simply return to rest once the immediate danger passes, indifferent to whatever happens to humanity afterward." "And if the danger doesn't pass?" I asked. "If the Dominion decides to escalate instead of retreat?" Nobody had an answer to that question, not yet. But somewhere beneath the restless ocean, the ancient presence that had slept through every human war and every human triumph continued its slow, deliberate awakening, patient and immovable, waiting to see whether the danger threatening the world it had sworn to protect would choose to leave quietly, or whether it would choose, foolishly, to test its strength one final time. I did not know, as I finally allowed myself to close my eyes that night, that the true confrontation had not yet even begun. The Dominion did not leave quietly. I learned this 3 days later, standing in the command center as reports flooded in from monitoring stations across every continent. Vorak Theln had spent those 3 days regrouping his fleet, gathering reinforcements from ships stationed elsewhere in our solar system, preparing for what our intelligence teams believed would be a final, overwhelming strike. He had lost face before his own commanders. He had underestimated a planet he called weak, and pride, it seemed, mattered as much to the Dominion as it did to any human general throughout our own long history of conflict. "They're moving everything," Grace said, studying the tactical display with a grim expression. "Every ship in the system. This isn't a demonstration anymore." I looked at the numbers scrolling across the screen and felt my stomach tighten. The Dominion fleet had grown to nearly triple its original size, ships arriving from staging points beyond our solar system, drawn in by a commander determined to prove that whatever had humiliated him days earlier could still be overcome through sheer force. Margaret Ashford stood near the far wall, her attention fixed on a separate set of readings, ones tracking the Warden's activity since the confrontation over the Pacific. "It's been quiet," she said without looking up. "Almost completely dormant since the encounter. I don't know if it's resting, or waiting, or simply indifferent to what happens next." "Can we contact it?" Locke asked, the question one he had repeated in different forms nearly every day since the first breach. "We've tried everything we know how to try," Margaret admitted. Sound, vibration, electromagnetic signals matched to the patterns it displayed during the encounter. Nothing has produced a response. I think it doesn't communicate the way we expect intelligence to communicate. I think it simply acts when action becomes necessary and rests otherwise. That evening, Vorak Theln broadcast a message across every open channel on the planet, his voice carrying none of the arrogance from our first meeting, replaced instead by something colder and more determined. "Whatever defended your world once will not be enough to defend it twice," he said. "We have adjusted our approach. We will not underestimate this planet again." I felt a chill listening to those words. The Dominion had studied the Warden's behavior during the first confrontation, analyzing its response patterns the same way they had once analyzed our satellites and our armies. If they had found a way to counter it, if they had found some weakness in the very defense that had saved us days earlier, then everything we had witnessed might have simply been the opening move in a much longer and much more dangerous conflict. The attack began at dawn. I stood beside Grace on the roof of the command building, watching the sky fill with descending shapes as the Dominion fleet began its assault. No longer a slow, methodical occupation, but a full and coordinated strike meant to break whatever resistance the planet itself could offer. Ships descended toward multiple anomaly sites simultaneously, their weapons already firing before they had even reached optimal range, saturating the areas with concentrated energy meant to prevent the Warden from surfacing the way it had before. "They're trying to suppress it," Grace said, watching through a pair of field binoculars. "Keep it pinned down before it can respond." For a long, terrible moment, it seemed to be working. Explosions rippled across the ocean's surface near the Pacific site, the water boiling under sustained bombardment, and no answering shape rose from beneath the waves. Similar scenes played out across the other known locations. The Himalayan range, lit by distant flashes of alien weaponry, the Andes shaking under an assault meant to collapse the very mountains the ancient Guardian had once used as a resting place. "It's not responding," I said, feeling a rising panic I had not experienced since the invasion first began. "Why isn't it responding?" Margaret's voice came through my earpiece, strained and urgent. "I don't think it can. Not the way it did before. The Dominion adjusted their weapons to disrupt the same energy signatures we detected during the first encounter. They're not trying to destroy it directly." They're trying to prevent it from gathering the power it needs to surface fully. I felt despair settle over me like a physical weight. For 3 days we had allowed ourselves to believe that Earth's ancient defender would be enough to save us, that we no longer had to fight this war entirely on our own. Watching that hope crumble beneath a strategy specifically designed to counter it felt worse, somehow, than if we had never witnessed the Warden's power in the first place. But General Locke, standing nearby with a communications headset pressed to his ear, suddenly straightened, his expression shifting from grim resignation to something sharper. "Bennett Sutton, with me, now." We followed him down into the command center, where he pulled up a live feed from a coastal monitoring station near Frederick Doyle's small fishing town, the same location Grace and I had visited days earlier during the evacuation. "Local reports are coming in," Locke said. "Civilians in the area say the water is behaving strangely, currents shifting against the wind, temperature dropping rapidly along a specific stretch of the coast. It's not the same pattern as the main anomaly site, but it's similar." Margaret leaned over the display, her eyes narrowing as she studied the readings. "It's not trying to surface at the primary site anymore. It's redirecting energy through smaller, secondary channels, ones the Dominion doesn't know about or hasn't targeted yet." "Can it still fight from there?" Locke asked. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "But if these secondary channels exist at other coastal locations around the world, and if the Dominion hasn't identified all of them, then maybe this isn't over yet." I thought of Frederick Doyle immediately, an old man living alone in a town he had refused to fully evacuate despite our warnings, choosing instead to remain behind with a handful of other residents who trusted the sea more than they trusted our evacuation orders. If the Warden was drawing strength from that coastline, he might be standing closer to the heart of this conflict than any of us realized. "I need to go there," I said before I had fully decided to say it. Locke studied me for a long moment. "Why you?" "Because I've been there. Because Frederick trusts me, and if there's any chance of understanding what's happening on that coastline, it will come faster from someone the locals are willing to talk to." I did not fully understand my own certainty in that moment, only that something pulled me toward that quiet fishing town with an urgency I could not ignore. Grace stepped forward without hesitation. "I'm going with him." Locke did not argue, though I could see the concern behind his eyes. "Take a transport. Move fast. If the Dominion redirects their assault toward that coastline, I want you both out before they arrive. Understood?" We understood, though neither of us fully believed we would have the luxury of choosing our own timing once we reached the town. The drive along the coastal road felt endless, the sky above filled with distant flashes of ongoing conflict, explosions rippling across the horizon like a violent storm too vast to fully comprehend. By the time we arrived, the town was nearly empty, most residents having finally accepted evacuation orders days earlier, but a handful of stubborn souls remained, gathered near the shoreline despite the chaos unfolding across the planet. Frederick Doyle stood among them, his weathered face turned toward the sea, watching the water churn in patterns too deliberate to be natural. He did not seem surprised to see us arrive. "It's drawing on this place," he said as we approached, not bothering with greetings. "Same as the others, I reckon, but quieter here. Older, maybe." "Older how?" Margaret's voice crackled through my earpiece, listening in from the command center. Frederick gestured toward a cluster of weathered stones, half buried along the rocky shoreline, formations I had not paid attention to during our first visit, assuming them simply natural erosion, shaped by centuries of tide and wind. Looking closer now, in the pale, storm-lit daylight, I could see faint carvings etched into their surfaces, worn nearly smooth by time, but still visible if you knew where to look, the same coiled shapes and guardian figures Margaret's team had shown us days earlier, pulled from ancient artwork scattered across human cultures separated by oceans and centuries. "My grandfather used to bring offerings here," Frederick said quietly. "Nothing strange, just flowers, sometimes bread. Said it was tradition, going back further than anyone in town could properly remember. Said the stones marked a place where the old guardian could hear us clearest." Grace knelt beside the carvings, studying them with careful attention. You think this is some kind of connection point, like an antenna? I think, Frederick said, that whatever's down there has been listening to this coastline a very long time, longer than the fighting up in the sky, longer than any war your kind has ever fought. The ground beneath us trembled, gentle at first, then stronger, the same rhythmic pulse Grace and I had felt days earlier, only now carrying a weight and urgency that made the earlier tremors feel like distant echoes by comparison. Out past the shoreline, the water began to glow faintly blue, the light spreading outward in slow, deliberate waves. "Margaret, are you seeing this?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "We're seeing it," she confirmed, her voice tight with excitement and fear in equal measure. "Energy readings at your location are spiking rapidly. Bennett, I think you may have just found exactly what the Dominion missed." Above us, the sky finally answered, alien warships altering course sharply as sensors aboard the Dominion fleet detected the sudden and unexpected surge of energy rising from a coastline they had never considered significant enough to target. Vorakthelm's voice crackled across intercepted channels moments later, no longer calm, no longer certain, ordering an immediate redirection of forces toward our location. "They're coming here," Grace said, watching the distant ships change formation. Frederick did not look afraid. If anything, a small, satisfied smile crossed his weathered face, the expression of a man who had spent his entire life waiting for a moment like this one, though he had never truly expected to see it. "Then let them come," he said. "This old guardian's been waiting a long time for someone foolish enough to test it twice." The sea around us surged upward, and for the second time in a week, something ancient and impossibly patient rose to meet a threat that had made the fatal mistake of believing Earth's silence had ever meant weakness. The water rose in a wall taller than the buildings behind us, and for a moment I forgot to be afraid, caught instead in something closer to wonder. Grace grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward higher ground, Frederick moving with surprising speed for a man his age, guiding the handful of remaining townspeople away from the shoreline as the sea itself began to reshape around a presence rising from its depths. I looked back once, unable to stop myself, and saw the same vast form we had witnessed days earlier over the Pacific, only now closer, more detailed, its ancient plated surface catching the pale morning light as it emerged fully from the water for the first time in this location. It did not resemble any single creature I could name. Parts of it moved like something alive, joints shifting with purpose beneath armored plates etched with the same coiled patterns carved into the stones along the shore. Other parts remained still, ancient and geological, as though stone and living tissue had merged so completely over countless centuries that no clear boundary remained between them. Its many points of light pulsed in that same slow, deliberate rhythm, brighter now, more urgent, casting a soft blue glow across the churning water and the frightened faces of everyone watching from the shore. "It heard us," Frederick said quietly, staring up at the massive form with an expression somewhere between awe and quiet vindication. "After everything, it actually heard us." Overhead, the sky darkened further as the redirected portion of the Dominion fleet arrived, dozens of ships descending toward the coastline, with weapons already charging, Vorakthelm's voice crackling through intercepted channels with an intensity that told me he understood exactly what he was looking at and exactly how badly his forces needed to destroy it before it could fully establish itself. "Concentrate fire," he ordered. "Do not allow it to stabilize." The first volley struck moments later, beams of energy converging on the warden's rising form from multiple angles simultaneously, the same coordinated strategy that had suppressed it during the earlier assault on the primary anomaly sites. I braced myself, certain we were about to witness the Guardian falter the way it had at the other locations, but something different happened this time. The stone carvings along the shoreline began to glow, faint at first, then brighter, matching the rhythm of the light pulsing across the warden's surface. Margaret's voice crackled through my earpiece, breathless with realization. The secondary channel, it's not just feeding the warden energy, It's stabilizing the connection. The Dominion's weapons disrupted the primary sites because they were isolated, exposed. This location has protection built into its very structure, something ancient, something deliberate. I watched the incoming energy strike the Warden's form, and rather than tearing through it the way it had begun to at the other locations, saw the impact absorbed and redirected, the ancient Guardian's surface rippling like water rather than shattering like stone. Whatever weakness the Dominion had discovered and exploited during their earlier assault, it did not exist here, protected by whatever bond had formed between this coastline and the presence sleeping beneath it for countless generations. The Warden moved. It was not the chaotic, defensive motion I had expected from something under sustained attack. It moved with the same strange precision we had witnessed during the first encounter, deliberate and controlled, rising further from the water until its full scale became almost impossible to comprehend, easily rivaling the largest structures humanity had ever built, ancient beyond any accurate estimate our scientists could offer. Alien ships that continued firing found themselves suddenly caught within reach of limbs that moved faster than their size should have allowed, pulled from the sky or crushed within grips that showed no mercy toward continued aggression, though I noticed, even in the chaos, a strange consistency to its actions. Ships that broke formation and retreated were left largely untouched, given space to withdraw. Ships that pressed the attack met swift and absolute consequences. "It's still doing it," Grace said, watching in disbelief as another fleeing vessel was allowed to escape untouched, while a ship continuing its assault was pulled beneath the waves moments later. Even now, even under direct attack, it's distinguishing between threat and retreat. I thought about what Margaret had said days earlier, that this presence did not seem to be fighting a war in the way we understood war, filled with anger or vengeance, but rather enforcing a boundary, responding with exactly the level of force required to remove a threat, no more and no less. It was a kind of judgment I had never witnessed before, ancient and impartial, indifferent to anything except the simple question of whether a given action still posed danger to the world it protected. Vorak Theln's flagship remained in the fight longer than any other vessel, its weapons continuing to fire even as smaller ships around it fell or fled. I watched the massive alien vessel maneuver with desperate skill, evading the Warden's reach again and again, its commander clearly unwilling to accept defeat a second time after the humiliation of the first encounter. "He's not going to retreat," Grace said grimly. "He's too proud." She was right. Even as his fleet crumbled around him, even as ship after ship either fled or fell beneath the Guardian's overwhelming power, Vorak Theln continued pressing his flagship forward, weapons blazing, driven by something that had nothing left to do with strategy and everything to do with wounded pride. I understood, in that moment, that his own arrogance, the same arrogance that had convinced him Earth was an easy conquest, was now driving him toward a mistake his own commanders would likely have advised against if given the chance. The Warden's response, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. A single limb rose from the churning water, vast and deliberate, and struck the flagship's forward section with enough force to send the massive vessel spinning off course, its engines flaring erratically as internal systems struggled to compensate for the sudden impact. It did not destroy the ship outright, it simply removed its ability to continue fighting, disabling weapons and propulsion with a precision that felt less like violence and more like a parent firmly correcting a child who had refused every earlier warning. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of the sea settling and the distant hum of remaining Dominion ships retreating rapidly toward high orbit, their formation broken beyond any hope of reorganizing for a third attempt. Vorak Theln's voice crackled weakly across intercepted channels moments later, stripped of every trace of arrogance I remembered from our first meeting. "Cease fire," he said. "All units, cease fire and withdraw." I felt something loosen in my chest I had not realized was tightly wound since the invasion began. Beside me, Grace let out a shaky breath, and Frederick placed a steady hand on both our shoulders, his expression calm despite everything we had just witnessed. "Told you, he said quietly. It was never about being strong enough. It was about waiting until it truly mattered. The warden did not pursue the retreating fleet. It remained near the coastline for several long minutes, its massive form still and watchful, as though ensuring the threat had genuinely withdrawn before allowing itself to settle. Slowly, its glowing patterns dimmed, and it began to sink back beneath the waves with the same unhurried patience that had defined every moment of its return, disappearing from view until only calm water remained where moments earlier an ancient guardian had stood in full and terrible majesty. The days that followed unfolded in a blur of disbelief and cautious celebration. The Dominion fleet did not attempt another assault. Whatever remained of Vorak Theln's forces withdrew fully from our solar system within a week, his final transmission to Earth's leadership notably free of the arrogance that had defined our first encounter, replaced instead by a grudging acknowledgement that their survey of our planet had been catastrophically incomplete. "We came seeking a world without defenders," his message read, translated and shared across every major news outlet on the planet. "We were wrong. This world remembers how to protect itself, even when its people have forgotten how." I read those words standing beside Margaret Ashford in a command center that finally felt less like a bunker and more like a place of quiet reflection. Around us, scientists and officers who had spent weeks preparing for humanity's slow defeat now worked instead to understand exactly what had saved them, though understanding, we quickly learned, would not come easily or completely. "We've barely scratched the surface," Margaret admitted one evening, sitting across from me with a cup of coffee long gone cold. "We don't know its full origin. We don't know if it was built by some ancient civilization we've never discovered, or if it simply grew alongside the planet itself over countless millions of years. We don't even know if it's a single consciousness or something closer to an extension of the Earth's own geological processes. Has it matter?" I asked. She considered the question for a long moment. "I think it matters to understand it, eventually. But I think, for now, it matters more that it exists, and that it chose to protect us." I traveled back to Frederick Doyle's coastal town several weeks later, once evacuation orders had lifted, and residents slowly began returning to rebuild what little damage the conflict had caused along that stretch of shoreline. Frederick greeted me the same way he always did, calm and unhurried, as though the events of the past month had simply confirmed something he had known quietly his entire life. "Been thinking about my grandfather a lot," he said, as we walked along the rocky shore, the ancient carvings now marked with small flowers, left by townspeople grateful for a protection they had only recently come to fully understand. Wonder what he'd say, seeing all this. Wonder if he always knew, deep down, that the old stories were more than just stories. "Do you think it's still down there?" I asked, looking out at the calm, quiet water. "I know it is," Frederick said simply, "same as it's been for longer than anyone can rightly guess. Waiting, watching, same as it'll keep doing, long after you and me are gone." I thought about that as I stood on the shoreline, the sea calm and unremarkable now, giving no hint of the vast and ancient power resting somewhere beneath its surface. For most of human history, we had looked outward, toward the stars, wondering what dangers or wonders might exist beyond our own small world, rarely pausing to consider what mysteries might still remain buried within the planet we had called home for so long. The Dominion had studied our satellites, our weapons, our fractured politics, and judged us weak because we had never learned to move past our own conflicts. What they failed to understand, what perhaps even we ourselves had failed to fully understand until now, was that Earth's true strength had never depended on human unity or human weapons at all. It had waited quietly through every war we ever fought against each other, patient and undisturbed, reserving itself for a danger far greater than anything we could create alone. We were never as defenseless as we believed. We simply never faced a threat large enough to wake what had always been protecting us. Grace found me there as the sun began to set, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and pink, utterly at peace, despite everything the world had endured in recent weeks. She stood beside me quietly for a long while, watching the same calm water Frederick and I had studied earlier, before finally speaking. "Do you think other worlds have something like this?" she asked. "Somewhere out there, other planets with their own ancient guardians, waiting for the right moment." I considered the question, thinking of everything Margaret's team had uncovered, and everything that still remained unexplained. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I know the Dominion will think twice before underestimating a quiet world again. Somewhere far beneath the calm water, stretching out before us, an ancient presence continued its patient rest, no longer entirely forgotten, no longer dismissed as mere legend or superstition. It had slept through the rise and fall of empires, through wars and peace treaties and centuries of human struggle, waking only when the world itself faced true and undeniable danger. Earth had never been weak, it had simply been waiting, silent and immovable, for those foolish enough to mistake its stillness for surrender. And somewhere out among the stars, word of what had happened here would eventually spread, carried by a defeated fleet, retreating in humiliation, a warning passed quietly between civilizations who had once considered our small blue world an easy and unguarded prize. Let them come, if they dared. Let them study our wars and our borders and our endless human arguments, and let them draw whatever conclusions they wished from what they observed on the surface. They would learn, as the Dominion had learned, that some worlds are never truly undefended. Some worlds simply wait, patient and ancient, for the moment when waiting is no longer enough.